Preterite versus imperfect. In your previous semester of Spanish, you should have studied these two verb forms individually. But now we're going to find out how to weave the two forms together in order to narrate a story in the past tense. This is a very tricky grammar point, one that many do not master for some time. But hopefully, this presentation will help to give you a firm basis on this grammar point so that you're able to navigate the past tense more easily. So, first off, let's talk about how verbs are described, or how we can talk about what they do. We can talk about verbs having tense, aspect, and mood, or in Spanish, tiempo, aspecto, y modo. Tense equals time. In any human language, we can only have at max three tenses: past, present, and future. Both English and Spanish have all three of these tenses. Aspect is how we describe the time, or another way of putting it is if we had to draw a picture on a graph of how time goes, it's the aspect that we would be describing. In Spanish, there are four aspects that we study: punctual, puntual; durative, durativo; perfect, perfecto; and progressive, progresivo. We'll worry about perfect and progressive at another time. For now, let's just focus on punctual. Punctual. When I say that word, what images come to your head? Perhaps you thought of phrases on time, at a given moment in time, to be on time. This is the right idea. In linguistic terms, punctual means the action has a clear beginning and an end, as if you were to draw a box around the action. And that's what they do in a story. They talk about the main events of the story. Now, durative. When I say that word, what comes to mind? Perhaps you thought of the phrase's duration, goes on for a while. Again, that's where we're going with this. In linguistic terms, durative means that the action simply exists in that time. There is no beginning or end. It's as if it just keeps going on a wave. There might be an endpoint, but it's not that important. As for mood, we'll come back to that in the next couple of hours. By the way, English doesn't have different verb forms for punctual and durative. We use adverbs and other descriptors in the sentence. This is what makes the distinction between preterite and imperfect so hard for speakers. We don't have anything to refer to it in our own language. So let's talk about preterite and imperfect. When do we use one versus the other? Preterite. This is the punctual form. Why? Because it describes actions in the past that happened at a specific time. We use the preterite to talk about steps in the narration. This is the key thing to remember about preterite. Remember, it's punctual. So these actions have specific beginnings and endings. It's as if you can put them on a timeline to talk about when events happened. For example, me desperté a las 5:45 esta mañana. Me levanté y usé el baño. Le di comida a mi gatita y puse el agua en la tetera para calentarse. Me vestí a las 5:15 y me maquillé y arreglé el pelo para el día. Me hice té y agarré mi comida para el día. Salí de la casa a las 6:45. Now, that story tells you what happened this morning, the events of the morning, but it feels empty, without emotion or feeling. It's simply the facts and nothing else. That is what preterite does. It conveys only what happened and nothing else. Imperfect. Now, this is how we interject emotion, feeling, warmth, and body to the story. If preterite is all about steps of the narration, then imperfect is all about description in the past. So, this is how I would interweave the imperfect to add more color and depth to my story. Me desperté a las 5:45 esta mañana. Yo estaba cansadísima y quería dormir más. Me levanté y usé el baño. Miraba mi cara en el espejo y yo parecía una bruja, con círculos oscuros debajo de los ojos. Le comí, le di comida a mi gatita, quien me hablaba mucho porque tenía mucha hambre, y puse el agua en la tetera para calentarse. Me vestí a las 6:15 y me maquillé y arreglé el pelo para el día. Después de todo esto, yo miraba un poco mejor, por lo menos presentable para el día. Me hice té y agarré mi comida para el día que mi esposo me preparaba mientras yo me arreglaba. Salí de la casa a las 6:45. So another way to look at this is that the preterite is like the skeleton of the story. It's the structure of the story. You can't have a complete body without any structure. Without a skeleton, we'd be a pile of muscle on the ground, unable to move. Well, without the preterite, a story doesn't move from beginning to end. Remember, it sets up a timeline of events. Imperfect, because it describes and such, is the muscles on the bones. It gives the story, the structure, some meat and body. It helps fill out the form. It provides detail and interesting elements that keep the audience engaged. Put preterite and imperfect together, and you have a full story. Just like bones and muscles, and yes, a bit of skin and such, gives you the complete human form. As was noted earlier, we don't have anything like preterite or imperfect in English. It's just not how we do it. We used to, back in Old and Middle English. Think 800 years ago or more. But it's been long ago replaced by adverbial phrases. For English speakers, this is what helps us to figure out when we use preterite and perfect. By thinking about what descriptors we would use with the verb, we can make the distinction. So for preterite, any verb phrase that denotes a change in the situation, like de repente, is always going to require a verb in the preterite. When you mention a specific day, like el lunes pasado, or a specific time, like a las 8, you will have to use the preterite. If you think about it, that makes sense. All those phrases are setting up a step in the narration, a moment in time on the timeline of the story. So they would naturally require the preterite. The same holds true for a phrase like cuando. It's setting up an event that is on a timeline. For imperfect, any adverb phrase that talks about a simultaneous action like mientras implies ongoing actions in the past. So you're required to use imperfect. Any phrase that implies repetition, like cada lunes or normalmente, again requires imperfect. Why? Because these are not events that happen only once at a specific time. They're either repetitious or ongoing for a long period of time and therefore require imperfect. Also, remember that age and time are always going to require imperfect. Above all, they are descriptions, and descriptions in the past are always imperfect in Spanish. Also, in English, when we would say used to, you're talking about a habitual action, so you'll be using imperfect. Remember, preterite is like a timeline. These actions in the preterite are events on the timeline in the story. But imperfect is the general description in the past. Tells you about the color, the emotion, what the weather was like, what time it was, all of these descriptive details, without which the story would be dry and dull and not very engaging. Now that we've talked about the difference between preterite and imperfect, we can understand why some verbs change meaning in one form or the other. Querer, saber, and conocer all have very different meanings in the preterite. Why? Well, how can you know someone for a specific period of time or want something for only 5 minutes? It's not a normal interpretation of that word. Other verbs like poder and tener have subtle differences in meaning. For now, it's important to know about these three. The others you'll get to later. And remember our forms for both the preterite and imperfect. There are the common forms here, plus a few irregulars. But there are more in the back of your textbook. Hopefully, this presentation has helped you to understand how best to use preterite and imperfect while narrating a story. Remember, this is one of the most difficult elements of Spanish grammar, particularly for English speakers. So this really is a case of practice makes perfect. The more you practice this and telling stories and narrating about what happened during an event, the better you will get.